Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, June 5th. The Liberal government avoided its first confidence vote on Wednesday evening as MPs adopted the throne speech. When debating legislation in the House, the Speaker will ask MPs request a recorded division or a standing vote. If no MP asks for one, the motion is deemed adopted. No MP asked for recorded division on the throne speech when the time to vote came, meaning it was passed without MPs standing to vote.
Adopted in reply to His Majesty's speech at the opening of the first session of the 45th Parliament, and C, the address be engrossed and presented to Her Excellency the Governor-General by the Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable members moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried.
The adoption came despite interim NDP leader Don Davies saying that his party would be voting against the throne speech earlier Wednesday.
And yet the throne speech doesn't even mention the words healthcare. You won't even find those words in the throne speech. There is no mention of non-market housing, cooperative housing, or housing for Indigenous people, some of the most acute needs in this country when it comes to affordable housing. And it foreshadows $28 billion in cuts that will absolutely hurt working people across this country. So we will be voting no against the throne speech and making sure that the interests of working people across this country are reflected, and we'll continue to fight for those measures that we know that so many millions of Canadians and working families need in this country.
If the throne speech had proceeded to a standing vote, the Liberals would have needed another opposition party to survive the confidence vote. Our correspondent Wyatt Sharp joined us now to unpack the Liberal Party surviving their first confidence vote. Wyatt, thanks for the time today.
Of course, thank you.
Now, why do you think no MP requested a recorded vote, especially given that the NDP publicly stated their opposition earlier that day?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the procedural questions that oftentimes people who follow kind of the House of Commons and politics closely don't really think a whole lot of, but someone who is watching perhaps from the outside, it might make them wonder a little bit. I would say kind of the primary reason for that is just MPs knowing the direction as to where things were headed, and they perhaps didn't want to waste a lot of time. I mean, you had mentioned the NDP interim leader who said that his party would be voting against it. That's contrary, though, to the Bloc Québécois, who had said that they would support the throne speech regardless, given that there really hasn't been a resolution in the US-Canada trade talks, and they feel going to another election right now would contribute to greater instability. So the government already had kind of enough people confirming that they would vote in favor of it, that it's likely the Conservatives and the NDP just didn't see a point in requesting a vote so that the inevitable could happen.
And how much do you think that not possibly forcing another election played into there not being a recorded vote?
Yeah, and it was interesting to me even that the NDP had came out and said that they were going to vote against the throne speech. And I think a little bit of that probably has to do with the interim leader, Don Davies, perhaps wanting himself to be in the spotlight for a little bit. If the party had went to an election, he would have been the face of the party, because the reality is the NDP won not even official party status in the last election campaign. Their fundraising is in a really bad state right now. Their polling numbers and overall kind of popularity for their party is not in a great state either. So it was interesting to me that the NDP seemed to be advocating for another election despite that. The Bloc Québécois, all things considered, didn't do that horribly in the last election. They only lost a couple of seats, so they're pretty comfortable with where they are at right now. And so it's certainly partially that. But again, also, as I mentioned, this idea that people don't want to force another election when the opinions of the country really aren't going to have changed that much since April. I mean, maybe some people's opinions will differ, but certainly someone who voted for Mark Carney in April, it's hard to kind of pick out people who wouldn't be willing to vote for him not even 2 full months later.
And what do you think was the reasoning behind the NDP saying that they would vote against it and then not doing it?
Yeah, well, again, that's kind of more of the procedural stuff. The reasoning for the NDP saying they didn't want to support the throne speech, Don Davies, you had played the clip there where he was talking about why the NDP wasn't going to be supporting it. For reasons that you would expect, they are unhappy with some of the cuts that the government is making in order to try and get back to a certain level of fiscal responsibility. The NDP is unhappy with how the government is approaching the issue of U.S.-Canada trade talks. The NDP interim leader had said that he feels Mark Carney is kind of bowing down to Donald Trump now and is not really taking this threat as a credible threat and not taking it seriously. I mean, the NDP, I think if it did come to a standing vote, they certainly would have voted against it. Again, it's just a matter of they didn't want to waste the time. They didn't want to go into this vote where they already had enough kind of verbal confirmations of people saying they would vote in favor of it.
And do the results likely mean that if there was a recorded vote, the Bloc would have backed the Liberals?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, I think the Bloc Québécois certainly right now is looking at the situation that's unfolding. They recognize that, well, they didn't make any substantial gains in for their party in the last election campaign. Things went much better than the polls were suggesting for them. Things went much better than they potentially could have for the Bloc Québécois. And so that party's leader, I think, is playing this under kind of the guise of, not wanting to risk going to an election to contribute to greater instability over the course of the trade war without having kind of a formal resolution or a former trade deal in the form of something like maybe the USMCA from 2017. But again, I think the reality of this is that a lot of it probably comes down to politics, and the Bloc Québécois usually is kind of the party where people, specifically in Quebec, will go when they're feeling apathetic towards the state of politics. And I think since April, perhaps the level of apathy has went down even just a little bit, and so the Bloc recognizing they probably wouldn't gain as much support.
And how significant is it that the Liberals avoided a formal confidence test on this speech? Does that kind of set the tone for future confidence votes?
Well, I mean, certainly you saw a number of confidence motions over the course of specifically 2021 up until the election that happened in 2025. And the reason the Liberals were able to survive all of them was because the NDP and Jagmeet Singh were willing to back them and willing to support them. Now, this is perhaps an indication that Don Davies and the NDP will not be willing to do so with this particular government, because, of course, now the NDP is going to want as many opportunities as possible to try and win back some seats for their parties. As I mentioned, they don't even have official party status right now. The Bloc Québécois might be kind of the safety net right now for the government, but that's likely to change again after there is a resolution with some of these trade talks, where then the Bloc Québécois might have some own frustrations. I mean, certainly right now they are unhappy with the Energy East pipeline and the situation surrounding that, how the government and Danielle Smith are trying to talk about potentially bringing it back. Quebecers and Yves-François Blanchet, the provincial government in Quebec, all of them are very unhappy about that. So that could be perhaps one reason why, in a few months when there is a resolution on the trade talks, maybe the Bloc Québécois will be a little bit more eager to go into an election.
Now, to switch gears, David Eby came out yesterday and said that he wouldn't support an oil pipeline going through BC.
Mhm.
How much does this speak to Mark Carney's unity goal that he set for the country?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's interesting, right? Because I just mentioned the Quebec example,
Mhm.
people who are opposed to it, people in British Columbia who are opposed to it, and then you look to all, the Prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, even Manitoba under Wab Kinew, who, they are generally speaking in favor of it. Ontario doesn't really have as big of a role to play with it, but certainly they are in favor of it as well. I mean, it is just kind of this big game. I mean, the provinces, I'm not going to say that the kind of state of intergovernmental affairs under Justin Trudeau was great, but certainly Chrystia Freeland and some of the other people around the cabinet table under Justin Trudeau, it seems, might have had more leverage with some of these provincial premiers than they do under Mark Carney. I think people recognize that it's because Mark Carney is kind of more of a moderate, and so people on the left-wing side of the spectrum feel as if they can convince him to their side. People on the right side of the spectrum feel as if they can convince him to their side, whereas people knew Justin Trudeau had his opinions. They weren't going to persuade him either way, and so it was kind of much more defined as to how people approach these types of conversations under Trudeau as compared to Mark Carney.
And following the First Minister's meeting, how much do you think that Danielle Smith's tone has changed towards Mark Carney? Initially she was a bit more closed off, but it is starting to seem like her narrative towards Mark Carney is changing.
It's interesting, yeah. I mean, even we just had reports from a few days ago that Danielle Smith had invited Mark Carney to go to an Edmonton Oilers game with her to talk about some of these issues. You mentioned the First Minister's meeting. There were clips of the two of them talking with one another. It's no secret, of course, that the relationship between Danielle Smith and Justin Trudeau was not a very strong or positive one. So certainly, it's not really a stretch to say that anything would have been an improvement from that relationship. So moving forward, it will be interesting. I think this, again, issue of the Energy East pipeline could be kind of, a potential point for more contention with respect to all of this. But there will likely be some similarities too. I mean, Alberta certainly has a role to play in some of these trade discussions. I talked to you earlier about the memorandum that was signed between the various provinces on free trade. Danielle Smith is certainly looking to be in favor of that and is supporting that as well. And so there might be more room for collaboration between her and Mark Carney as opposed to her and the previous government.
Wyatt, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
All right, don't go anywhere. Coming up, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. Former astronaut Marc Garneau, the first Canadian to space, has passed away at the age of 76. We'll have this story and more news right after the break. Former astronaut and cabinet minister Marc Garneau has passed away at the age of 76. A statement from his wife, Pam Garneau, says that he passed away peacefully after a short illness surrounded by his family. The statement says, quote, Mark faced his final days with the same strength, clarity, and grace that defined his life. Mr. Garneau was an author and a pioneer in Canada's space program, serving as president of the Canadian Space Agency before serving as a Liberal member of Parliament between 2008 and 2023. Here's a look back at his time as an astronaut, showing his love for Canada.
Mark, you're rather busy up there, 8 hours a day you're spent conducting experiments, and another 8 hours, if you're lucky, you're sleeping. Are you getting much time just to gaze out the window and wonder at the splendor of it all?
Yeah, actually, I'm getting all the time I can. In fact, every time we go over Canada, I'm generally stuck at the window having a look out there. I haven't been able to see it all because of some cloud, but certainly I'm getting my share of the time at the window, and it's absolutely fantastic.
I sat down earlier with former MP Kevin Vuong to discuss Mr. Garneau's passing.
Kevin, thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure.
Now, what was your relationship like with Mr. Garneau while you were both members of Parliament?
So I was very lucky. My first office at Parliament Hill was in the Confederation Building, and it was right beside Mark's office. And so it was one of the first early days when I'm still like a rookie MP up on the Hill, and I'm walking. I think I was going to the washroom on the way back. I bump into a man who I had learned about, had read about, and who greatly admired. And he was right then and there in the flesh. And he was really gracious in taking the time to meet with me, to share his experience as a member of Parliament, pass on words of wisdom to someone who was clearly very awestruck. And, he was a naval captain. And as a Lieutenant Navy, as a Naval Reserve officer, I like to think there were a lot of parallels there, and the fact that he took the time to speak with me, to share what he knew, both as a parliamentarian, but also in his experience in the Navy was phenomenal.
And what do you think you'll remember the most about him?
I think that for me, I'm lucky enough to have had that personal interaction. So I just remember how kind he was. This was an individual who was not only Canada's first astronaut, which a lot of people will know, but was also a cabinet minister who had served this country in and out of uniform, in and out of office. He was president of the Canadian Space Agency. I think Canada's most famous astronaut is Commander Chris Hadfield, because he was the first Canadian commander of the International Space Station. But the person who was Chris Hadfield's role model, his inspiration, was Marc Garneau. Mark helped to really open the doors in the imagination of Canadians, not just at sea, on the land, but also in the skies and in space.
And what do you think Mr. Garneau should be best remembered for? And what is the legacy that he's leaving behind?
It's a really hard question to answer because this is an individual who has contributed so much to this country. All of the different domains across all of the different files that he held as a cabinet minister. For me, I think it was he, for me, encapsulates kind of like what is possible if someone is willing to work hard and is dedicated to this country, all of the different ways that you can serve in and out of uniform.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to pay tribute to what was an incredible and frankly a heroic Canadian.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says he'll pause before deciding on retaliation against Donald Trump's double tariffs on aluminum and steel, which took effect on Wednesday. Mr. Carney said Canada is in intensive trade decisions with the U.S. and that any discussion on retaliatory measures will take some time. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said that Mr. Carney should respond immediately and not let Mr. Trump, quote, steamroll Canada. About half of Canada's steel plants are located in Ontario. Industry Minister Melanie Joly echoed the Prime Minister's comments.
Dollar for dollar retaliatory tariffs. At one point in the campaign, the leader, Mark Carney, was talking about that. Why not dollar for dollar tariffs today?
So I don't know if it was you or somebody else asked them already the question. It is an important question. We have had really strong counter tariffs against the Americans already. With China and now newly Mexico, we've imposed important counter tariffs. We will make sure that we impose maximum pain to the U.S. while having minimum pain, minimum impact to Canadians. We are looking at different scenarios right now, and we will take a decision, but we need a bit more time right now, not too long. But of course, what is fundamental is we need to make sure that in everything we do, we're able to get to the best deal with the Americans, but at the same time that we're able to create and protect jobs here in the country.
The national voice of Canada's billion-dollar steel industry says the federal government needs to take swift action as it faces a threat from increased U.S. tariffs. The Canadian Steel Producers Association's Catherine Cobden says the industry will become a deeply weakened sector in short order if 50% levies remain on steel and aluminum imports to the U.S. Ms. Cobden says that at that rate, the U.S. market is now effectively closed to Canadian steel, leaving billions of dollars of Canadian steel without a market. The Industry Association is calling on Ottawa to expand a 25% tariff on metal products into Canada to avoid steel imports destined for the U.S., flooding the Canadian market. A Canadian labor group is calling on Ottawa to immediately reform employment insurance and introduce targeted wage subsidies to support workers struggling with new U.S. tariffs. Canadian Labour Congress President Bea Brusk says that Canada must also respond quickly.
President Trump's tariff hike is reckless, and it will cause economic damage on both sides of the border. We stand with Canadian workers, with businesses, with local economies to keep this country going. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, Donald Trump's unjustifiable and reckless tariffs are an attack on Canada. Since November, Donald Trump has been threatening thousands of jobs and entire industries right here in our country. And now, with his decision to double tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to a staggering 50%, that increase taking effect today, Donald Trump has made it clear that he isn't backing down. And I can tell you neither are we. Canada will not back down. This decision by the U.S. administration risks cutting us off from our largest trading partner and threatens to devastate the Canadian steel and aluminum sectors. There is so much at risk. Canada must act with strength and with purpose, and we have to respond with unity and urgency. Urgency is key. We need bold, targeted action to defend workers and to protect our economic sovereignty, starting with emergency reforms to employment insurance so that when workers are laid off, they are not wondering whether or not they can support their families.
Ms. Brusk says that some 23,000 steel jobs across Canada will be affected within the next few days, and another 9,500 aluminum jobs. Immigration Minister Lena Diab says that the government's border legislation includes safeguards for due process and civil liberties. The bill proposes a wide range of reforms, including sharing immigrants' personal information between government departments, Critics argue that the government sharing personal information between government departments risks violating civil liberties. The bill would also give the government the power to cancel or suspend immigration documents in a health or public safety emergency. But Ms. Diab says using the power would ultimately be a cabinet decision. This morning, while in Brussels, Canada's defense minister spoke to the press, speaking ahead of today's NATO meeting.
And today, the importance of this alliance has never been clearer and cannot be overstated. Canada's commitment to NATO is unwavering, just as we are in our belief that North American and European security are indivisible. Just 6 weeks ago, Canadians elected a new government with clear marching orders from the Canadian people, established a clear mandate, and our Prime Minister has been unequivocal. Canada will invest in its defences, rebuild its military capacities, and meet the moment with purpose and with urgency. Our government is already very hard at work. There will be more to say very soon as we look to revisit and review our expenditures domestically, continentally, and internationally. We are under no illusions about the scale of the challenges ahead. Russia's unprovoked and brutal war against Ukraine continues to destabilize the global security landscape. China's growing ambitions and increasingly assertive behavior are eroding stability in the Indo-Pacific. And the erratic actions of regimes like North Korea and Iran are undermining the rules-based order we all depend on. In the face of these growing threats, we must all do more. We will all do more. And I'm looking forward to those discussions with my counterparts here today. Thank you.
When we return from the commercial break, Doug Ford's government grants itself the power to suspend provincial and municipal laws for projects of economic importance. And wildfires in Canada create smoke hazards stretching into the U.S. After that, Health Canada says a pharmaceutical company has issued a birth control recall because it contains too many placebo pills. We'll have these stories and more of today's top national and international headlines right after the break. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's government has given itself the power to suspend provincial and municipal laws for chosen projects in areas it deems to have economic importance, citing the need to speed up the development of mines. But First Nations warned that confrontation is brewing. Known as Bill 5, the legislation sparked a firestorm of anger among First Nations communities, who say that it tramples their rights and ignores their concerns. Indigenous leaders spoke out against the bill.
We are, have spoken out in terms of opposing this, not that we're against securing economic ventures, but that our right to assert ourselves as treaty people of Ontario is being ignored, and that this engagement process that the provincial government is speaking of is they are going to be telling us, they're not going to be consulting, and our position is that they should have come to consult with us and get our consent prior to drafting of this bill. We have been very firm as Anishinaabe Nation and standing behind our leadership in taking that position.
Justice Minister Sean Fraser made headlines this week when he implied that the duty to consult Indigenous peoples when approving infrastructure projects did not mean that those communities have a veto power over approvals.
Government understands the declaration on the rights of Indigenous people to have free, prior, informed consent over all these projects.
Well, look, I think it's...
They have a veto is what I'm asking.
Well, the international commentary and the limited jurisprudence that we've seen on it indicates that we do need to fully engage, and to the extent there's the potential to have a more direct impact on Aboriginal and treaty rights, it demands a higher degree of engagement. The commentary has suggested to date that it's not necessarily a blanket veto power, but of course we're in new territory here. Over the course of the next generation, I expect the courts are going to do some significant work, but hopefully a lot of that work is actually going to be done as between governments and Indigenous peoples themselves through engagement and conversation.
So the courts will have to listen to what the government understands the principle to mean, and I'm asking, never mind the commentary, What do you and your Prime Minister understand free, prior, informed consent to mean? Does it equal a veto?
In most circumstances, I think it demands a very deep level of engagement and understanding of the rights that may be impacted, and to the extent that those rights can be accommodated, we should make every effort to. The explicit nature of a veto, so far my understanding is it stops short of a complete veto, but it certainly, in my view, heightens the demands upon government to engage fully to both understand the nature of the rights that could be impacted by decisions taken by government, but also the heightened duty to accommodate those rights that are baked into our treaties and protected by our Constitution.
However, the minister very quickly walked back those comments, apologizing and stating that his words, quote, potentially eroded a very precarious trust. Earlier, we sat down with Jennifer Lawitz, CEO of Pasqua Strategy, for more on the duty to consult.
Jennifer, thank you so much for the time today.
Yeah, thanks.
So I want to start with what you made of the Justice Minister's initial comments and then his apology afterwards.
You know, this seems to be a reoccurring theme, especially with politicians, is that they say one thing in a broad spectrum. You know, the flowery language from government is always there. But then a lot of the time the mask comes down, especially when ministers or any politician is asked one-on-one how they feel about something. That's kind of where we get the real tell about, you know, the state of their opinion on Indigenous issues and all of those different things. And I think right now we're kind of just seeing what the truth might be behind some of our federal elected ministers and their opinions.
Now, many Canadians might not truly understand what exactly the duty of consult means. Can you walk us through what it is and what it's supposed to mean in practice?
Oh, that's tricky because duty to consult is going to mean something different for everybody and essentially something different for every nation as well. Consultation really at the end of the day is, you know, the act of consulting with the original rights holders of the land in Canada, and that is First Nations, and we are protected under Section 35. But the issue is that it's not just consultation that's important. There's another big word that's missing, and that is consent. And you know, it's like I said, it's going to differ nation to nation, but right now nations are actively asserting their jurisdiction over their own lands and their rights, and consultation and consent are incredibly important. But in order to properly define, nations need to actually be actively working on their duty to consult protocols. So what consultation means to them, what they map out as their traditional territories, and the protocols that they expect to see when being consulted with.
And has Canada historically done a good job at including Indigenous voices in the decision-making processes and major projects?
No. I don't think there's ever been a government that's been, you know, respectful or fully understanding of the role that they play in government when it comes to consultation. But one of the issues is that we have major organizations in Canada that are essentially lobbying groups and organizations on behalf of First Nations, FSIN, AFN. Those are two organizations right there that are lobbying groups at the end of the day. And people often forget, especially government, that the AFN and the FSIN are not the rights holders. They're a lobbying group. So a lot of the time is they think that they can go to the AFN and consult over things like child welfare, resource development, things like that. But these organizations are also actively not consulting with nations. So that is kind of where the issues are. And I think that there needs to be a better understanding of what it actually means to consult and try to reach consent with the original rights holders.
And could the fast tracking of new projects potentially add more tension between Ottawa and Indigenous peoples?
Oh, 100%. I think the Jobs and Growth Act under the Harper years, we saw what that looked like. Just to clarify, I am not against resource development in any capacity. I've seen the benefits that resource development has brought to our communities and our people. I married someone that worked in the northern mines for over a decade. But at the same time, our nations need to understand what resource development looks like for our rights, for our lands, for the environment, and for our people, and also be active stakeholders in those projects should they come. Because a lot of people think that it's just land defenders that are getting in the way, and that's not it at all. And I applaud anybody that advocates for anything to do with our traditional territories and the protection of our environments. But it's also making sure that we have a fair shot and a fair seat at that table in resource revenue sharing as well. And realistically, one of the only parties I've actually kind of heard talk about resource revenue sharing was the Conservative Party of Canada. Not traditionally great with consultation or consent in any regard, but that conversation started opening up just beyond the environmental piece and started talking more about what fair resource revenue sharing actually looks like.
Well, yesterday, Ontario passed Bill 5, and Indigenous communities expressed strong opposition to that bill. What are their primary concerns?
I think just the consultation piece, and also that we're seeing a government in a province in Canada that wants to look to override legislation and the rights, and bylaws and everything in between from municipalities, province, federal. So we are kind of seeing what it looks like now for a province to feel like they're in a state of urgency when it comes to development and saying, okay, right now we just need to get boots on the ground. We need to see projects rolling. Let's pass any type of legislation we can that will trample anything that might stand in the way, any barriers or any holdups.
And does this passing of the bill go hand in hand with Ontario not doing a good job including Indigenous voices in the decision-making process, or historically has the province done a good job with that?
I don't think any province has. There obviously in Canada there are provinces that are more, environmentally aware than other provinces, and sometimes that goes hand in hand with Indigenous people being consulted. But at the same time, there are so many other layers that people don't realize go into what it looks like to actually deal with provinces on even resource development projects. Because if you're seeing a province pass legislation that makes it easier for projects to go ahead, what does that actually look like for First Nations at those tables and at those seats? I've seen nations that want to get involved in projects, and there's so much bureaucracy created for us, even in terms of power in Saskatchewan. We don't have decentralized power. So any project that has to do with power purchase agreements, you need that PPA agreement. While nations are constantly trying to navigate federal, municipal, provincial bureaucracy, but then these provinces come in and they're like, we're just actually going to assert our own jurisdiction and legislation that makes it easier for us to develop. But at the end of the day, what does that still do for us and the seat at the table? So we have the environmental impact, we have the revenue sharing, and us actually being active and engaged stakeholders that get a fair piece of that project.
Well, thank you so much for the time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Wildfires in Western Canada are creating smoke hazards stretching into the United States. Environment Canada says wildfire smoke from British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba has traveled as far as Texas in the United States. They say smoke from wildfires in Ontario and Quebec may have also floated south to Michigan and the eastern seaboard. Environment Canada has issued bulletin warnings for poor air quality in parts of northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where wildfires have forced more than 30,000 people from their homes. Health Canada says a pharmaceutical company has issued a birth control recall because it contains too many placebo pills. The recall covers 2 lots of seasonal birth control with expiry dates of January 31st, 2026 and September 30th, 2026. The agency says that Teva Canada received a complaint that the package had an extra row of placebos in place of the active pills. Health Canada says anyone who has an affected batch should return it to the pharmacy without skipping any active pills. Up next, Trump reenacts the travel ban from his first term as president, and a robot delivery pilot program kicks off in Markham, Ontario. We'll be right back. U.S. President Donald Trump signed a proclamation Wednesday night, preventing people from 12 countries from entering the United States. The ban will take effect on Monday at 12:01 a.m.
Very simply, we cannot have open migration from any country where we cannot safely and reliably vet and screen those who seek to enter the United States. That is why today I am signing a new executive order placing travel restrictions on countries including Yemen, Somalia, Haiti, Libya, and numerous others. The strength of the restrictions we're applying depends on the severity of the threat posed. The list is subject to revision based on whether material improvements are made, and likewise new countries can be added as threats emerge around the world. But we will not allow people to enter our country who wish to do us harm, and nothing will stop us from keeping America safe. Thank you very much.
The list results from an executive order that Mr. Trump issued requiring the Departments of State and Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence to compile a report on hostile attitudes towards the U.S. and whether entry from certain countries represented a national security risk. Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com joined us for more on the ban.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to see you again. Appreciate the time.
Now, we've been here before with Trump enacting something similar in his first term. Is there any evidence that this makes Americans any safer?
Possibly. Now, you got to go back to the first term. You're exactly right. Now, that was called the Muslim ban, even though it expended a little bit more than just that. But they got put out, then it got revised, then it went through the court system, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled on a stark divide that this was within the purview of the president to do. And one of the important parts of that ruling was they have to separate what he says in rhetoric, and he likes to lead by dictate, to what the actual law says, and the law gives him the power with very broad discretion to do this sort of thing. Now, the numbers is the part that gets kind of tricky on this. These are mostly countries that are danger zones. They are failed states. They are dictatorships. They are places that aren't going to have a lot of people coming into the country anyway. So is it going to be kind of on the margins as far as the numbers go? Yes, but the bigger part of this is the rhetoric and the perception of it of this is strong. He mentioned the Colorado case and the Boulder attack against the Jewish protests, even though that wouldn't have stopped that particular individual who was a visa overstay. And they've learned because that first batch from the first administration in this executive order, when you read the fine print, very specifically talks about things like visa overstays, talks about cooperation with deporting back. This is an administration that is adapting and learning. So even though it is a remix from the first one and the actual numbers may not be a big bump in what they're saying, they are learning, adapting, and getting a little bit better at this.
Now, I want to break down some of the dialogue that Donald Trump used yesterday when addressing this travel ban. So, what exactly does hostile attitudes towards the U.S. mean? And does that open the door for poor decision making on who can enter the U.S.?
Well, it's a good key point to get into because it means basically right now, until it's litigated by a court system, whatever Donald Trump wants it to mean, because again, this is an executive order. So until it's challenged, hostile action means whatever it. Now, clearly you have places like Iran is on this list. Iran every Friday has state-sponsored cheering for death to America. Clearly they're a threat. There's other things like Venezuela, which has a dictatorship that we have issues with. Cuba, which has been a problem for decades and decades and decades. They're back on this list now again. So there are threats here, and there is a clear and needed issue with some of these countries. But you're right, the nomenclature matters a lot. And until the court system goes through it, which they may not do because the Supreme Court precedent has now been set on this, it means pretty much whatever they want it to mean. So they can point to something that pops up in the news item. They can point to anything they're doing with the deportation in individual cases and use it. And now they have a justification in the executive order because it's going to take a while to get anybody to push back against it because it's just that an executive order, and Congress is probably not going to have the appetite to challenge him on any of this.
And what would this mean for people who are trying to flee these countries and go to the United States?
Well, there are going to be some exceptions, but now it's going to be a whole lot harder. And remember, one of the things the Trump administration has really cracked down on is things like the asylum system and things like that. It's already overwhelmed anyway, but with them being on this list, you basically have to go directly through the State Department and get high-level authorization and waivers to get anybody through these things. For example, one nation on this list is Afghanistan, and it's already been a point of contention. Afghanistan refugees, a lot of whom helped us during the 20 years America was in Afghanistan, being here have now become subject to deportation. Now, nobody else is going to be coming, and there's a lot of good, valid reasons for that because of the Taliban, but it's an excellent point of exactly how complicated this can get in a hurry. People that legitimately need to try to get a refugee status or asylum, or people we are working with. Remember, our clandestine services work with people in these all the time. They would like to normalize these folks that help us and come into the country. They're going to have a much harder path to do it. It's basically going to have to come directly from the Secretary of State to get a waiver for any of this.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for the time today.
Anytime, Teresa. Appreciate your time.
A fleet of delivery robots is being tested in Markham, Ontario, in a groundbreaking pilot project led by Skip, formerly known as Skip the Dishes, and Kitchener-Waterloo startup Real Life Robotics. This is Canada's first municipally approved sidewalk delivery operation, with hundreds of orders already completed. We sat down with Cameron Waite, CEO of Real Life Robotics, to discuss how to ensure the safety of those robots, especially in regards to seniors and people with disabilities.
So I think, at a core, safety and accessibility, they're pretty core to our design. And it's also important to note when you're deploying technologies like this to make sure that you engage with the major stakeholders that are going to be involved in that deployment in that community. So we've certainly done that. The robots move slowly. They have a huge suite of sensors that give them a really significant level of spatial awareness, so they know where they are in the world and what's around them. So they understand obstacles, people. They pause and reroute as necessary around people or obstacles, and then we test to make sure that they can operate with everybody in mind. And that's part of what this journey is and this experience is putting the robots into a real world. We have the robots also accompanied with robot guides. And the idea there is to understand that human robot interaction, answer any questions, field them as needed, and really just understand and make sure that these robots are being deployed in the most safe and effective way.
We also touched on how the company is improving the robot's performance and public acceptance.
Well, the real world is always going to throw you curveballs. That's one of the exciting parts about doing this, and why we wanted to do this in partnership with all these stakeholders, was to really put the robots in a real world experience, in a real life experience, as opposed to being in a simulator or in a lab. And so, a great example is just recently a construction site popped up in the middle of our operational geography. And so, in that scenario, what we did was create a new route map for those robots. So we sort of create a geo fence that tells the robots, hey, you can't go here. You're gonna have to reroute accordingly. And then the robots, we go test it, make sure it works, and then you deploy it to the entire fleet. So it's actually kind of nice to be able to have those real world experiences, because it gives us a chance to test our own workflow and our own operations in terms of how we're going to be adjusting to that real world environment.
And finally, we chatted about the future balance between automation and human employment in the anticipation of increased competition in the delivery robot space.
Look, the reality is we're not replacing anybody at all. If anything, that this is it's a new modality, it's a new option for consumers at the end of the day. For organizations like Skip, they have car couriers, they have bicycle couriers, and now they have robots. And so it's up to the consumer to sort of make that call, but it gives them at the end of the day another modality, another option to be able to have that delivery service. Competition is healthy, and it's certainly a sign that there's interest in the market. So I see that it certainly is a good thing. From our side, we try to keep it simple, right? We focus on the service. We're focusing on what clients are actually paying for. There's a lot of companies out there that are still trying to scale their organization in the R&D side while also serving customers. And our experience is that just it doesn't work, right? It drains capital, it takes time. It doesn't often align with what the clients really want or need. So really focusing on that client experience, that client journey, understanding how our partners and our customers make money, and making sure that we take the time to have this technology deliver the commercial value to them is really what we focus on. And that's all we can do.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says she's invited Mark Carney to watch an Edmonton Oilers Stanley Cup final game. Ms. Smith said that she's waiting to see if Mr. Carney will join her for Game 5, which could happen next weekend before the G7 conference. Mr. Carney grew up in Edmonton and made his allegiance to the home team clear when he stopped by Rogers Place to skate with the team in March. Ms. Smith said that she's pleased that Canada has a prime minister, quote, who knows what team to root for. And the Edmonton Oilers won Game 1 of the Stanley Cup final against the Florida Panthers yesterday after Leon Draisaitl netted his second of the night with 31 seconds remaining in overtime on a setup from Connor McDavid. Last season ended in heartbreak for the Oilers after they clawed their way back from a 3-game deficit against the Panthers, only to drop the final in Florida. But unlike last year, Edmonton has home ice advantage with the puck drop at Rogers Place for the first 2 games before the series shifts to the Sunshine State. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. Good night, Canada.